Come closer. It's coming a little closer. Yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone. Morning. Thank you very much for joining today's SAIAB seminar. It gives me really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dave Ebert this morning. He is really made a career out of searching and finding for lost sharks, rays, and ghost sharks that nobody's even heard of before. And he actually first gained an interest in sharks as an enthusiastic 5-year-old, and I'm sure he'll give a little bit of history in his talk. But he made it his life goal to become a shark researcher, even during a time when this wasn't even a field of study. So he decided, this is what I'm going for, and he's really pursued that and is sort of a living example of really following that lifelong dream. Throughout his career, he's met really influential and passionate shark researchers, including Leonard Compagno, and who many of you might have heard of, and he's managed to really follow this childhood dream, carving out an incredible life for himself, really researching a whole bunch of different sharks, rays, and ghost sharks, and he is more commonly and affectionately known as the Lost Shark Guy. He's currently the program director for the Pacific Shark Research Center at Moss Landing Marine Labs in California. He's authored, and this is quite impressive, hence my paper, 35 books, including the very well-known and used sharks of the world. He's published more than 700 papers and book chapters, has supervised more than 50 students. And on top of all of these amazing achievements, he's also discovered and named over 50 shark species, many of which are from Southern Africa. And on top of all of that as well, he's appeared in several TV programs for the BBC, National Geographic, the Discovery Channel, and he's got his own podcast called Beyond Jaws. So today's talk is talking about searching for lost sharks. And with all of that, Dave, over to you.
All right, thanks, Taryn. Well, it's really nice to be back here. Last time I think I spoke here, I was a graduate student, probably like 3 or 4 years ago. And so it gives me a great pleasure to come back and have an opportunity to share some of my experiences over the last several decades in terms of pursuing my love for lost sharks. So let's start off with talking about, let's see here. You can imagine about being an explorer just 35, 40 years ago. Paul Cowley and I would load up my bakkie and we set off for Namibia. We'd tell Leonard Compagno, our advisor, and a few other people that we're going to be gone for 8 weeks. And if you didn't hear from us in 10 weeks, you might send somebody to look for us. And off we'd go. Now, this is back in a time where there was no GPS, no cell phones, no nothing. All we really had was just like a map and a compass. And we'd go off to explore a part of the world in the Skeleton Coast, along the Namibian coastline, in an area where sharks had never been studied before. And just to be curious, that's actually Paul Cowley. I took a picture of him. We took a picture back in the day when we did these explorations up the coast. And as I say, no one had ever really studied or looked into sharks up the Namibian coastline like that. So we'd go off these journeys. The thing about being an explorers like we were is that it's kind of like a metaphor for life. It's the path you want to choose. So the question is, you want to pursue a path as an explorer or a settler? I'll come back to that in just a few minutes. So, but off we go on our journey to look for sharks. But to jump into like a little brief history on sharks science, really, the field of shark research, I want to go back in time a little bit to really before World War II, there was no field of shark science, of shark research. And I put this pretty picture of the whale shark here because a lot of people don't know that prior to that, the whale shark was actually discovered and named from South Africa. Anybody, I don't know how many people knew that or were aware of that. Interesting though, it didn't come off like the KZN coast or something. It was actually from a specimen that was harpooned in Table Bay. And it was described in 1828. And back at that time, Andrew Smith was the person who described it. And interesting, in the article, he described the whale shark, and if you read to the end of the article, he describes another species in there. It was a stingray that was quite common in the common world, and it is today. And it was known as the blue stingray, Daisyatus chrysonota. And if you know Paul Cowley, that was his MSc thesis he worked on. And he actually came across that when he was doing his research there. But the reason I highlight this whale shark here is that it was very typical at that time where people would find maybe a new shark or something, or they thought it was new and they would describe it, or they do like a catalog of like species that occurred in South Africa or Southern Africa or Indonesia or wherever, and they just catalog it. But that was really the extent of shark research prior to World War II. But from World War II, during World War II, a lot of stories of pilots, sailors that had survived like a horrific combat experience would find themselves in the ocean. And despite they just survived this horrific experience, stories of them being attacked and sometimes eaten by sharks started filtering back to the US and elsewhere. And so even though people had been in this horrific war experience, the whole thing that somebody would be potentially attacked and killed by a shark seemed to grab the public attention. And one of the best stories or well-known stories at the time involved this boat. This was the USS Indianapolis. And this was the boat that delivered the atomic bomb to Leyte Island in July of 1945. And on its return trip, this ship was torpedoed and sank. And because it was on such a secret mission, there was no radio contact with them, that when the ship sank, about 900 of the 1,200 men on board survived the initial torpedo and sinking. However, because they're on radio silence, these guys spent the next 5 days in the water floating there. And during that time, many died from injuries they'd received. They died from dehydration and other causes. And yes, some were killed by sharks. And it was really a fluke that they were discovered. A plane was flying by and saw these guys in the water, but only about 300 of the 900 people who went in the water actually survived. But because of that whole horrific experience after World War II, the U.S. military, particularly the Office of Naval Research, started looking into coming up with shark chasing. In fact, the story was so well known at the time that if you've watched the movie Jaws, there's a famous scene in there where Quint, the captain of the boat, shares a story that he was one of the survivors of the USS Indianapolis. So I say is after the war, there's a lot of research started to go into looking at shark repellents, because again, people were just really concerned about, like, my God, if I end up in the water, I might be eaten by sharks. They put a lot of money into that. And that's what really kind of started the whole area of shark research, that it had to do really with looking at shark attack and how to prevent shark attack. And some of the early people, and this goes back like mainly in the 50s and 60s, that started out that we're looking at were some of these people here. And again, if you're in the shark field, these are people, if you don't know, you should be aware of. In the upper corner there, you have in the middle there, that's a young Eugenie Clark, who was the first director of the Cape Hayes Marine Lab, which became Mote Marine Laboratories in Florida. And on the lower corner there is Perry Gilbert, who was a very prominent name in the field of shark research at the time, which again was mainly shark and shark attack. And between them is a young Sylvia Earle. Some of you probably heard her. She's still very active and around now. But Perry Gilbert, just wanted to come back to in a minute. He edited 2 volumes, one in 1963, which was titled Sharks and Survival, and another one in 1967, Sharks, Rays, and Skates. And in the 1963 version, actually, Dale B. Smith had contributed a chapter in there on shark attack in South Africa. And so really for the next decades, even when I came along in the 1980s, those were still books that were kind of primers for entering into shark research. Now below them is Jack Casey, who started the Apex Predator program for NOAA Fisheries. First it started in New Jersey, and then they moved to Rhode Island. And he was, again, a very prominent person in the whole field of shark research. And he was actually one of the examiners on my PhD committee. And I got to know him. In fact, all these people here I've known that we've got to know at one time or another. In the lower corner is a young Nancy Kohler, who we'll talk about. She eventually succeeded Jack in running the Apex Predator program. And down here, you have Jack Garrick from New Zealand, who essentially wrote the book on sharks and rays in New Zealand. But beyond that, he actually did a lot of other very broad works, including a 1982 publication on the sharks of the genus Carcharinus. And what he did is he took all these names that a lot of them were not valid names and basically condensed them down to like how many species of Carcharinus whaler sharks are there? And it was a very seminal piece of work. Again, if you're in the shark field, you can download these things as PDFs for free online. It's an important document to have. And up here in the corner here is Stu Springer. And he was one of really the grand old guys of early shark research. And he actually came from background as a fisheries person. He worked in the shark fisheries as a commercial fisher and everything. And he had such a keen interest, and he was a very learned person. And he finally got a bachelor's degree when he was 58 years old. And that was because he worked himself into having a position with what was used to be Fish and Wildlife, later became NOAA Fisheries. But he had a very keen interest in stuff, and he just, as he learned and worked and stuff, he did actually the first ecological paper on a shark, which was a sandbar shark, and was published in 1960. Now, for some of us, 1960 is not that long ago. For some of you, it might be a lifetime ago. But that was really the first paper on a life history of a shark was just done in 1960. So to give you how little people spent time in terms of studying sharks. And he just worked on a number of species of sharks. He also worked with someone I'll talk about in just a moment. But I just want to finish up that I had an opportunity to meet almost all these people except for Stu and Jack I corresponded with. And when I was a young master's student, they were very nice and very gracious to take time to write me back. I'd ask them questions on cow sharks and other species of sharks. And at that time, thinking that you had to type a letter or you had to handwrite it, put it in the mail, send it off. And then a few weeks later, I'd get a response from them. And I've saved those letters because they're just very sentimental to me now at this point in time, because these guys are very prominent individuals. And the others, as I say, I actually knew quite well at one time. Coming here to South Africa, South Africa during the same time had a very active shark research program that started really in 1959 and had to do with a series of shark attacks that occurred during the Easter holiday, during the Easter break. And the person who was initially put in charge of it, this woman in the middle, Jeanette Daubry, which basically she headed up the first sort of shark research program at Ori. This again started in 1959, and with her was Nat Kisnasamy. And two of them really started up with the shark program. And had to do with David Davies, who was the director at the time for Ori. And then John Bass came along later in the 1960s, and the three of them published a series of just seminal works that, if you're not familiar with them, either the sharks of the east coast of Africa, you should be aware of, and you can download most of these things as PDFs online. And, if you're a shark person, you should be aware of it. But they just did some tremendous work, kind of in parallel with these other people that I was just talking about. And also at that time, you had John Wallace, who published on the rays, which were almost unheard of. Somebody publishing all the bad toys at that time. He did a series of publications that complemented the shark volumes that Bass, Daubry, and Kisnasamy did. And all three of them were all at Ori. And then the other person, Butch Hulley, was at the South African Museum, and he really kind of wrote the whole book on skates of Southern Africa. So these five people were just doing tremendous amounts of work. And again, there's a few other people there. But one person I want to mention is Jeanette Daubry was really ahead of her time in the stuff she was doing. And I mentioned, if you look at some of the work she did, and you look at Eugenie Clark, who's very well known and very prominent shark research, and they were contemporaries in the 60s, and she was very much as accomplished as Jeannie was, but Jeannie had National Geographic down the street from her university in Maryland. Jeanette didn't, she was in South Africa. But if you ever look at someone who was very much of a trailblazer, a pioneer, and explorer, she definitely would be amongst all of these other individuals here. And also at this time, you had these young kids here, I know some of you know. You had Leonard Campagno, Sonny Gruber, and Don Nelson. I was fortunate to know all of these individuals. Of course, Leonard was my advisor for my PhD. And Leonard is actually from San Francisco, and he came to South Africa in about 1985, and he basically spent the rest of his career here. And he still was over in Cape Town now. But the three of these individuals all benefited from Office of Naval Research shark attack funding for most of the 60s and throughout the early parts of their careers. In 1983, when they were kind of wrapping up a lot of the shark attacks up, they had a meeting in Florida. It was hosted by Bernie Zernak, who was involved with the Office of Naval Research. And at that meeting, where they ended up producing a volume from that, they came up with the whole idea of the American Elasmobranch Society at that meeting, and which eventually came to fruition in 1985 when we started. And again, there are other people here I could bring up. I think of some other people, but these are just, I've mentioned them because they're I knew them, they're always very prominent, and they also started the early days of the American Elasmobranch Society. So while all this was going on, there was a young lad of about 5 years old who received a book from his parents on sharks and just thought these were like the coolest things he'd ever seen. Like, man, these are really cool. And so, you're 5 years old, sharks, dinosaurs, whales, all kind of really cool. And you get excited about it, but you think like, okay, well, that he'll grow out of it eventually and stuff. But when I was about 10 years old, I thought, somehow I want to figure out a way to travel the world and study sharks. I had no idea how I was going to do that, because keep in mind, there was no field of shark research. But in my mind, I had no idea that. I just knew what I wanted to do at a very early age. However, fate sort of intervened in the early 1970s, 1971, when this movie, Blue Water, White Death, came out. And this featured a lot of people, introduced the world to people like Rod and Valerie Taylor, Peter Gimbel, Stan Waterman, and a number of other people became very well known. And what they did, other than like most other people that were going out and doing these big shark kills and trying to catch the biggest shark around here, they actually went out to try and find a white shark and film it in the wild. And if you haven't seen this movie, you should, because actually part of it was filmed up off Durban. When they used to have the whaling station there, they used to bring in these big whales, the sharks would follow them in. And when they went there to film it, of course, they couldn't find a white shark at that particular time, but they've got some amazing footage of oceanic white tips. And so if you guys ever want to have a fun night and watch a historical thing, this is a really kind of a good movie to watch. But it's very, compared to today's videos, it's very raw, and it's very much, they show whales being harpooned, and it's very graphic, but it's a very captured point in a time in history. But this movie really, because of this movie, people started getting had a little more interest. It's the first time they started introducing like, well, sharks aren't these like killers out there. They were actually just there were fish out there we really knew nothing about. But the book and the movie that really changed the landscape here, of course, was the movie Jaws. Well, the book and then the movie Jaws by Peter Benchley and Steven Spielberg. And that just changed the whole landscape, because like I can attest to this, having grown up in the Monterey area. I was around the water all the time. I started free diving when I was about 8 years old, so I was just used to being on the water. And you just knew there were sharks around. It was just, and there's plenty of white sharks around there, but you just never thought about it. Occasionally there'd be an attack, and maybe be a one-day news thing, like a diver or a surfer might be attacked. But after Jaws came out, everything changed. After that, every little shark sighting, every shark attack became a big event. And it was just because suddenly it just put the sharks in the public conscience. And they had these big shark tournament hunts. These guys go out for monster sharks. People like Frank Mundus in New England, who the character Quint was modeled after, became almost like a household name. And he was known for going out and catching all of these big sharks at the time. Well, that's been pretty well documented. People talk about like how Jaws, even Peter Benchley and Steven Spielberg talk about how Jaws was kind of a bad thing and that it caused all these sharks to be killed. Well, that's really not true, because again, I was in high school when the movie came out, and the thing is what it really did is it sort of brought sharks out of the shadows, because sharks were being fished, sharks were being killed, just nobody paid any attention to it. But after this movie came out and there was a lot of hype and people go out and do these shark fishing tournaments, and people started looking at it, people started asking questions though, like, well, how many shark species are there? How old do sharks get? How many young they have? A lot of these questions that nobody really asked before. So as they started asking these questions, of course, in the movie, you have these things like a very, big point in the movie is when the shark Jaws jumps in the back of the boat and eats Quint and stuff. And I can remember the first time I saw this, and we thought it was like a big monster movie and stuff. Again, I grew up on the ocean, so we just took it as a monster movie at the time. But we also thought, like, there's no way in heck these sharks can jump. They're, white sharks are just too big. They're too clumsy. There's no way. Well, as we all know now from Chris Fallows, these white sharks do breach quite spectacularly. And actually, funny story is that when I first came to South Africa, the first person that told me these sharks breached was Tom Peck, of all people. And I remember him telling me this stuff, and I was like, okay, I was a little skeptical, but he told me this stuff, but as I came to realize later that, yeah, these sharks actually are pretty impressive what they can do. So actually, the reality is almost the truth and versus fiction is quite interesting in that, we thought, there's no way these sharks could actually breach like this, and it turns out they actually can. So, and it actually turned out now there are other places, even though fall space is well known, there are other places in the world these sharks will actually exhibit this behavior. But again, this was starting to bring out, people were starting to pay more attention to sharks and what was going on. And if you watch the movie, I don't know if, I'm sure many of you have already seen this, but if you watch the end of the movie, you'll see this name come up, Mr. LJV Capano. And I don't know how many of you knew this, but Leonard actually designed the mechanical shark Bruce for the movie. And in fact, he was a graduate student at Stanford University at the time, and Steven Spielberg flew him down to Burbank, and he spent a couple of weeks down there designing the mechanical shark. And I have to tell you, when I saw that movie when I was in high school, I mean, that shark looked really real. If I watch it now, I'm like, this looks like a kind of mechanical shark now. But at that moment, it looked really real. But I thought it was kind of interesting. And for those, I know some of you know Leonard. If you knew Leonard at all, you can just imagine him and Spielberg running around. I'd love to have been like a fly on the wall to see how that worked out. That would have been interesting. Let's put it that way. So, but anyway, all this was going on. People started getting more interested in sharks, and as they were and paying more attention to them. So as all this was coming along, again, when the movie came out, I was in high school, and I remember going to see my high school counselor. This is after the movie had come out. And again, there was the only thing in shark research or shark field was shark attack. I remember going to see my counselor, and he was so what are you doing, Dave? You're gonna graduate high school? And and he goes, and I said, well, I'm gonna go to college, and I'm gonna go out and travel the world and study sharks. And he was like, well, that's nice. Do you have a plan B in mind? No, not really. And so he was, we talked a little bit. He wasn't very negative at all. He said, he kind of like talked a little bit. He said, kind of good luck on that shark thing. And off I went. And it was interesting. It was about 10 years after that, just before I came to South Africa, I saw him, and we started talking a little bit. And I said, remember me talking to you about telling you I was going to go travel and study sharks? And he goes, oh yeah. He goes, the thousands of kids I had, you're the only one that told me you're going to go study sharks. And I said, so what'd you think about that? And he said, I really didn't think the shark thing was going to work out, to be honest with you. But keep in mind, there was no field at the time. But he just said, you had a direction in life. And that was the important thing. He says, I get kids coming in here all the time, going to be graduating high school. I have no idea what they're going to do. You had a direction. I didn't think the shark thing was going to work out, but I wasn't going to stop you or get in your way. I thought you had a direction, go for it. And so I always thought that was very, touching, that he didn't want to stop me. He didn't want to say, it's kind of a crazy idea, but it was just the fact that he just thought you have a direction, go for it. And so I always thought that was pretty cool. So I went to go to, funny story, I hadn't thought about this till I was talking last week, but when I was applying to go to college, and I was in high school, I was kind of like I was an AP student. I don't know if you have something similar like that in South Africa, but in the US, we have nowadays what's called an AP student, which means advanced placement. So if you're a gifted high school student, they'll put you in advanced college prep courses. Well, back in the 70s, we had an AP program too, but meant for academic probation for the guys that weren't exactly going anywhere. I was an AP student in the 70s. And so I was, but what I also did, I was a pretty good athlete, and I played, football, wrestling, baseball, track. I mean, I was always doing something. And when I was going to go to college, I wanted to continue wrestling, because I just thought it was like the best sport. I really enjoyed it, and I just wanted to pursue that direction. And so I went up and I met with the wrestling coach at Humboldt State, which had one of the top teams in the country at the time. And I had talked to him, and of course I went around with the campus but I was really, thought I'd go there. It'd be a good starting point for me to pursue my dream to study sharks. Well, as you go along in life, there's always a lot of obstacles that pop up along the way. Well, one of the first challenges I had was, as I was waiting to get my acceptance letter from Humboldt State, I got a letter from them that said, "Dear Mr. Ebert, thank you for your application, but sadly, we're not going to accept you into the program at Humboldt State." So I got turned down. Coincidentally, it was either late that evening or the next day or so, I got a phone call from the wrestling coach. asked me like, you still interested in coming up and wrestling for me? I said, well, yeah, but I got this problem. I got this rejection letter from the university. He goes, oh, don't worry, throw that away. You'll get your acceptance letter next week. I was like, okay. But, you know, I didn't look, you say like, yeah, okay, I got in, and I literally got into college through my athletic, not my academics. But, you know, what I took it as is an opportunity. They let me into, I was able to get into school, and it was up to me if I was going to exceed or, you know, excel or perish. If I failed, I failed. That was me. That was on me. If I made it, then that was on me. And that was one of the things I think I mentioned. I liked wrestling because when you're wrestling, you know, it's just you and your opponent. You win or you lose. It's just, you know, you lose, it's on you. You win, it's on you. But you also get opportunities in life. And I had that opportunity, and I was going to try to make the most of it. So I went off to Humboldt, pursued my, you know, academic career, which was a little rocky still, let's say. I didn't really fully grasp it, you know, but I managed to get through and graduate with a degree in zoology. But before my last semester, I ran into a professor I had there, and I do a little bit. He was actually an invertebrate professor, and he asked me what I was going to do. And I said, oh, you know, hey, I'm going to graduate next semester, and I'm going to take off and travel the world and go study sharks. And he goes, no, that's kind of nice, Dave. Let's go have a cup of coffee. And, you know, sometimes you meet a lot of people on your journey in life, and sometimes you just have a cup of coffee with them, but they can really influence the trajectory of your life. Sometimes other people become lifelong friends. Well, when I was having a cup of coffee with this professor, he said, you know, that's really great. You got a direction and stuff, but if you want to go anywhere in the field, you really need to get a master's degree. I'm going like, oh, God, master's degree. I'm barely getting out of here with a bachelor's degree. I still hadn't caught on to the whole academic thing at that point in time. So I looked around. I go, if I'm going to go to a master's, I'm going to pursue something in sharks. I'm just not going to waste. I'm ready to roll in the shark stuff. Turned out that the lights are out. I was able to Moss Landing Marine Laboratories, which was not 5 miles from where I grew up. They were starting a shark research program, and again, this all came off the Jaws movie. Greg Kaye was the ichthyologist there. And at that point in time, in the early 80s, they were, you know, were getting funding for age and growth studies, or reproductive studies, life history studies, again, just because people wanted to know more about sharks. So I went out and I went over, made an appointment to talk to Greg, and this is all like the last minute. I was just planning to graduate and be out of here. And so I went out, so I went and talked to Greg. I thought I had a pretty good meeting with him. What? Okay. So I had a pretty good meeting with him, but again, I was just kind of finishing up the meeting with him. I said, like, you know, Greg, my grades aren't like really great or something. I didn't really think I was like, you know, much for a grad school program. And he said, like, and I said, so what do you think my chance of getting in? And so Greg goes like, you know, Dave, getting in is not going to be your problem. Your problem's going to be getting out of here. I was like, okay, but he gave me an opportunity. And that was the big thing, is that, okay, again, it was on me to exceed or fail, but at least he gave me that opportunity. So anyway, so I went on, so I came back. So I went ahead and applied. I got into the program, and then I sort of showed up at his office there out first semester, and he said, like, okay, great, I'm here. Like, what do you want me to do? And he goes, I don't know, it's your thesis, you go figure it out. I'm like, okay. And I didn't really know. I mean, I had no idea. I didn't even know what I was doing in grad school at this point in time, but I was in grad school. You know, of course, my parents are thinking like, oh, thank God he's not flipping burgers at McDonald's or something, you know, or in a correctional facility. So anyway, so basically Greg said, you know, it's your thesis, you figure it out. And again, it was kind of a life lesson I thought about later. I thought, well, okay, I'll go figure something out. So I ended up going up to the California Academy of Sciences, because one of the people who was very prominent in the news at the time was a fellow named John McCosker, who was a well-known fish taxonomist, but he also worked on white sharks. He's very much in the news. So I just thought, well, I'll go talk to this guy. And John, he was really good. We had a nice little talk, and he says, well, you know, Dave, there's these big sharks out here called 7-gill sharks in San Francisco Bay. Why don't you, like, you know, study those? And I was like, great. I had no idea. I didn't even know what they were. I just thought, okay, sounds like good. There's a good shark out here. I'll go study. So I drove back down to Moss Landing Marine Laboratory. It's like, went to Greg's office, said, Greg, I'm going to study 7-gill sharks. He's like, oh, you study Notorhynchus? I'm like, what's that? He's like, get out of my office. Don't ever come into my office and waste your time or my time if you don't know the scientific name of the species you're going to study. So head hung low and completely deflated. I wandered out there, but you know, it was a good life lesson because why am I going to waste his time and my time? I wasn't prepared. So I went back and we did a lot of research over the next week or two, learned everything I could, which was not very much about 7-gill sharks. I went back and I had a great meeting with Greg. But again, it was one of these life lessons you'll learn along the way. Like, yeah, why am I wasting his time? And so off I went doing my PhD at that time, or that's my master's at the time at Moss Landing. Well, along the way, as I was working on my master's, I got to know a fellow named Leonard Campagno. And Leonard's from San Francisco, and he was working at the Tiburon lab across the bay. And so we started talking, and we got to be really good, pretty good friends while I was there. I'd come in and talk to him about stuff. And he was just an amazing guy to get to know. And you go along in life at times and you meet a lot of really good people along the way, but now and then, if you're lucky, you meet someone who's like a fellow traveler. And Leonard was that fellow traveler in my journey because I knew where the road I wanted to go on. And I'd met some great people, but Leonard was that guy who was on the same path that I wanted to go on. But he'd been obviously further down the path, and he was an experienced guy, a knowledgeable guy, and he became quite a mentor towards me. And so I got to know him, he ended up taking it. In fact, when I first got to know him, he was working on the Catalog of the Sharks of the World, which was published by NAVO in 1984. And that was really the last project the Office of Naval Research ever really funded. That was kind of it. And that was in 1984. And he was working on that when I first got to know him. And so as we went along, as I got to know him there, and as he was getting ready to head off to South Africa, I went up, had lunch with him, and say goodbye and everything. And as I was leaving, I kind of said, hey, if you need anybody to carry your bags or anything, like, let me know. When you say that, you don't expect anything to actually come of it, right? Well, about 8 months later, Leonard called me up. He says, hey, I have a PhD bursary here at JLB Smith. Do you want it? I was like, hell yeah. So within like a nanosecond, I was like filling out applications, sending stuff to Rhodes University. And the next thing I knew, I was on my way to South Africa to study sharks. And like basically this lifelong dream I had was coming to fruition. And had like this amazing time here. And those of you that were around said, this is the day I turned in my PhD thesis here. Paul Cowley brought me back a little present from Port Alfred here, and had a nice time. But anyway, always we had quite a, if you were around at that time, we had quite a party that night with Paul, because Paul submitted his MSc and I submitted a PhD. So anyway, it's kind of a good thing. But at that time, again, getting into this whole thing of the era is that there was no real rules of the road. And when I was coming through, and I came with a lot of amazing people, I mean, it was a time, if you thought of something, you could like pursue it. And one of the things is, again, many of you probably aware of this book I did with Leonard when I was a student here. And a couple things that I didn't think about at the time, but I realized years later were very novel at the time. And a couple things I pointed out here is that we wrote this section on conservation and management. And the thing is, this book came out in 1989. Nobody had ever written anything on conservation of sharks. It was, and I mean, if you find anything, please let me know. I've never been able to find anything before this section here we wrote on conservation of sharks. And also, and in that thing, we talked about, like, we came with this whole thing of how many sharks are actually caught. And I was talking to people last night. Like, we used to go to like Guido's Pizza Place over here, Glenn and I, and find us there at least a couple nights a week. And we'd get these amazing discussions. And we started talking like, well, how many sharks are probably killed a year in bycatch? Well, I don't know. Well, Leonard, being Leonard, went back and pulled up a bunch of data. And we came up with these calculations that somewhere between 10 and 63 million sharks a year are probably killed. We figured an average of about 38 million. This is 1989. We're doing this here. When we put this in this book here, it was like 12, 13 years later before Shelley Clark published a more quantitative paper estimating that the high number might be 73 million sharks killed a year, with maybe about 40 million on average. She almost came up with the same numbers doing a very quantitative study versus what we'd come up with in 1989, doing a less quantitative analysis. And the other thing in here, I think it was on page 143 if you're interested, but the other thing we put in here, we talked about this shadowy fishery of shark finning, which again, nowadays it's very much in everybody's mind about finning sharks. Well, back then, like, people were finning sharks, but just nobody thought anything about it. We'd see it going on. You might go to places, fisheries around here and see people cutting off fins, but we didn't think we just thought it was an interesting fishery. And Leonard, who grew up in San Francisco next to Chinatown, was well aware of, again, shark finning was going on back in the 40s and 50s, but nobody thought anything about it. And that's why I come back and talk about how the Jaws thing, nobody paid attention to this stuff. Was paying any attention to prior to that movie coming out. So I was very fortunate to grow up in this era, and to say we kind of became sort of I refer to as a Jaws generation of people. And these are some of the colleagues we all came through at the same time in the middle of Lisa Hansen, who worked. We started our master's degree together at Moss Landing. She became very high up in NOAA fisheries. She's one of the prominent shark Asian growth people. Over there is Janine Kyra. She's a professor now at the University of Connecticut. Basically has written the book on shark parasitology. Eileen Grogan down there, she was a paleontologist who studied fossil sharks, particularly chimeras and ghost sharks. Very well published. She's a professor at St. Joseph's University. Linda Martin down here, that's a young Jeff Carrier, if you know him, very prominent in the field. Linda Martin also came out of Greg Kai's lab, and she started doing outreach to the public through the Monterey Bay Aquarium on shark conservation in the late 80s. Again, in early 90s, nobody was even thinking about this anywhere, but that's the kind of novel stuff that there was no like, boy, you thought about something, let's give it a try and see what happens. And over here is Nancy Kohler, who I mentioned earlier, who became the director of the Apex Predator program in 1995 when Jack Casey retired. She ran that for the next 20 years until she eventually retired. And above her is Sarah Fowler, who essentially started the field with Sonny Gruber of shark conservation in the late 80s, early 90s. No one was even thinking about shark conservation. So it was really, so for me, it was kind of cool because we all kind of grew up together in the same field. And another person who was part of that whole generation was this guy here. And so so it's kind of neat. And I mentioned some people you meet like in life, you just meet for a brief time, like have a cup of coffee or something, but they can change the trajectory of your life. Other people you meet and they become lifelong friends, fellow travelers in your journey. Paul's one of those people, along with Leonard, who somebody became one of my best friends. We've been all over the place, and this is from Namibia here. This is more recent. And we're not drinking coffee, by the way. Paul. We graduated a little bit at that point in time. But it's just one of those things that is some of the real cool things you meet as you go along, as you travel along. Now, as all this stuff was going on, all these researchers and developing this stuff, Peter Benchley, after the movie Jaws, wrote a number of other novels, The Deep, The Island, The Beast, and stuff. A lot of those things were made eventually into movies. But later in life, he became to really regret having done the whole Jaws book and the movie because he felt it was such a negative for sharks. And yeah, while there was a lot of shark tournaments and everything, became the only good shark was the dead shark type of mantra. It really, as I said, it brought sharks out of the shadows. This stuff was all going on, but nobody paid any attention to it. And Benchley unfortunately died in 2006 from cancer, but I never knew him at all, obviously, but I don't think he ever realized just what a profound effect he had in really launching the modern field of shark research and shark science, because there, as I said, there was nothing before them. And most of us now, myself and people I showed there, Paul and everything, we've now gone on in our careers and had our own labs and our own opportunity to influence young people and educate and train the next generation of shark researchers. These are some of the students from my lab here who've now gone on now they're all starting early in their careers, and hopefully they'll be able to perpetuate what they have learned along this journey. And a couple of fun things I just want to mention here is I do things now at this point. I like to try some different things. I'm doing a podcast. If you haven't checked it out, please do so. It's kind of fun. We do talk about sharks, and with a lot of those podcasts, we have people on to talk, particularly people who've been around for a while, talk about their personal journey and where they've gone throughout, how they got there. Because people, a lot of particularly young people, are just amazed at no one has a straight line to where they want to get to in life. But the thing I've really found a lot of satisfaction, because I've gone on now and I'm just kind of doing I always like to like challenge myself to do something new. It keeps me young and energetic and wanting to go do things. And I come to, as you know, South Africa a lot, and I go to other parts, Asia and other parts of the world, Latin America. It just gives me a lot of pleasure to work with a lot of these young people. This is Dr. Baraka Kugulu in the Tanzanian Fisheries Department. This is a young ichthyologist, Hamish, met in Zanzibar. He was just, Rhett was there. We're just walking around. We saw this guy was out there trying to identify fish and stuff. And so we exchanged numbers, and he, for quite a while, was sending me pictures of all these sharks and rays he was catching. They'll ask me to help him identify stuff. These are some students from the University of Mauritius I was working with to show them how to train them how to identify deep sea sharks. And this is Adriana Ceballos from Ecuador, working on some projects looking for lost sharks there. And she's working on a master's degree now as well. But one particular person I wanted to mention here was a fellow I met who works for Rhett in Zanzibar. This is young Abdullah. And when I was in Zanzibar a couple of years ago, Abdullah would come by every day to the hotel we're at, and we'd meet about 10 o'clock and go off to the fish markets every day. And one day he was about 10, 15 minutes late. I didn't think anything about it, except he comes rushing up, in Zanzibar. It's like really hot and humid and everything. And he starts apologizing for being late. I was like, no, don't worry about it. It's a few minutes late. We've got plenty of time. And he said, well, he lost his phone. And I said, do you want me to go help you find it? He goes, well, actually it got stolen. And I think, oh, well, let's go maybe talk. I was going to say, let's go talk to the police or something, because I'm talking to him. He has this big patch on his shoulder here. And it's like, what happened? He goes, oh, when they robbed me, they stabbed me with a panga last night. And I'm like going, holy geez. So he spent the whole night in the hospital, left the hospital and walked about 6 kilometers just so he wouldn't miss a day going to the fish market with me. Now, obviously I didn't take him to the fish market. We put him in a cab and sent him home. But it struck me at how much he did not want to miss a single day, an opportunity to go to the fish markets. And, in that part of the world, they don't get he doesn't get an opportunity, someone like him to meet, someone like me to have a chance to work with. And he was so eager to want to do something contribute to his community, that he's willing to, basically nearly died, will leave the hospital, just walk there just so he didn't miss a single day. But it struck me, like, why is he doing this? Why is he so dedicated to this? Well, it has to do with something like this. This is what's called the lost shark, Carcharodontis alcelaris. This is actually a Southeast Asian species. It was named in 2019. This species has not been seen since 1934. It was basically declared extinct upon it being formally named. It's only known from a few specimens. And this is the kind of thing that I do. While everybody looks at white sharks, manta rays, whale sharks, these things there's other species like this. I can go on for an hour, different species that are disappearing rapidly. Here's a good example of one. Here's another one. This one brings more closer home to Africa here. The sawfish used to be very common in East Africa. And we know that because, unlike a lot of species, they cut off the rostrum, and people have them around their homes as curios and everything. And we know these things used to be common in the 50s and 60s. And in the 70s, they started disappearing. When I was here, I think I saw a couple of them at the time, but it's almost like an event to see these things. Young Abdullah will probably never see one of these things in his career. His kids or grandkids almost certainly won't, unless something radically changes. These things are just rapidly disappearing. And outside the United States and Australia, which are kind of the last two strongholds, these things are just vanishing throughout the world. This is a wedgefish. These things are still fairly common to see, but they're critically endangered and they are rapidly disappearing. The thing is with things like the wedgefish and sawfish that are rapidly disappearing, is that why Abdullah is trying to do something to work with his communities to make sure that these things don't disappear, that his kids and grandkids can still see wedgefish out there about his home in Zanzibar. And so, as I kind of hear the story, it brought it home to me that, here was a fellow traveler. And much as when I was starting off my career, Leonard Campagna was that fellow traveler, that senior person that I really got it. I was on that path journey. I realized Abdullah's in that same journey, but now it's my turn to be that senior person to a young person like this, like Abdullah and others, as they set off on their journey. And I'm gonna close by saying that, the thing I always tell people, especially young people, is you pursue whatever you want in life, whatever it might be, always pursue it with a positive attitude, with a drive, with a focus, with persistence, and whatever else, with passion, and you'll be amazed at where it'll take you in life. And so, I'll close by just asking the question I asked before. Do you want to pursue a life as an explorer or a settler? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dave. That
Yeah.
was really interesting. It's the second time I've heard it, but it's still
Yeah.
an amazing talk.
Oh, thank you.
I'm going to open the floor up to questions before we jump online. So has anybody got a question or a comment?
There you are, great talk.
Thank you.
On too, but like Karen said, I've always been curious about the large tooth sawfish.
Mhm.
'Cause I remember seeing one in the Durban Aquarium before they moved to Shark. It was like a maze one.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious, I know that these sawfish get stuck in gill nets very easily. And that's sort of one of the, like what I've read about, sort of one of the main contributors to them being harvested. And in South Africa, do you think I don't want to tune the shark nets, but in terms of shark net catch, has that, is there clear evidence, were they ever caught in the shark nets? During the
They catch, I think they used to catch them occasionally.
Yeah,
But what really, from what I know, and I can speak a little bit this when I was here, is that they're kind of a nuisance. The guys didn't really like to catch them,
yes,
but their fins are extremely high value.
Yeah.
And because there's buyers in the Chinese market for them, they suddenly become this nuisance to like, well, let's catch one because people target them more. And again, I can't, because it started going down in the 70s and then in the 80s. But I know when I was here, the fins, again, nobody talked about, but we knew the fins were valuable. And so there was more of an incentive to catch them because you could make a lot more money, relative to, may not have a lot of money in the bigger scope of things, but to that person or that, village, that was a lot of money for them. So suddenly these things weren't a nuisance anymore. But how is I don't.
just trying to figure out which sort of fishery or which.
We gotta
operation,
catch-
'cause,
Yeah, in South, you get the St. Lucia and stuff, they used to be kind of common up there, but that's
Yeah.
weren't really up there that much,
Yeah.
more around Durban.
Exactly,
And then you go up into East Africa, you didn't have nets,
yeah,
and they've all disappeared throughout that whole area, so again, I don't know for sure, but I don't think the nets had is.
exactly, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it'd been other
That's
stuff.
interesting, I'm just.
I
they're
think-
basically extinct, they're extinct. In South Africa, they're extinct.
Yeah, I think 1999 is the last one in South Africa, and I think it's more this fishery goes on, because the other thing is that where they're caught, they're usually not caught at the major places, these smaller villages where they get caught.
Yes.
Nobody's, Rec can probably talk to this with his stuff, people don't monitor those places as well as the major places, so. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Anyone else? Yeah, and Dave, I'm not driving here probably.
Yep.
Okay, I'll read them out. Question from Alwande Dube. Dave, do you believe that public awareness campaigns are the key to changing societal attitudes towards sharks, or do you place more emphasis on policy and legislative actions?
I think it's I think if you can develop some good policy stuff that fall, I'm not saying that doing some of the societal attitudes, I think there's some policy stuff's important, but you can also, some of the stuff I mentioned, like doing sort of outreach stuff and shark education and stuff, and talking about, because everybody thinks about shark attack, but bringing awareness to these, I like to try to do these lost sharks is important to do. I think it's a combination of both.
An anonymous attendee, the field of marine science has witnessed several technological advancements in recent years, such as satellite tagging and DNA analysis. How have these technological tools impacted the study of shark behavior, migration patterns, and population dynamics? Are there any exciting developments on the horizon that could further enhance our understanding of sharks?
I think it's kind of a great time to be doing sharks now, because you have all these technological advances. You got drones, you got satellite tags. We used to put on like little sheep ear tags or spaghetti tags, and you'd let the shark go, and somebody might catch it and call you, and all you knew is you tagged it here and it turned up here. Whereas now you can literally determine where the shark is every part of the day. So that's kind of a cool, that those technology advantages, I think, are going to help in a lot of ways, kind of gray or black areas. We really didn't know, like these, like in the tagging, you tag it here, let it go. I think DNA is also another one that's going to be really important in terms of helping. It's a tool like for determining species, of whether it's the same species or different species as well. So it's an exciting time, really, with all these technological advances.
What are some of the most pressing threats faced by shark populations around the world? Are there any specific conservation strategies that you believe have been particularly effective in protecting sharks?
I think the biggest thing, because everywhere is different. I don't like to put like a blanket policy, because what might work in South Africa may not work in Australia or New Zealand, or what might work in Ecuador. Again, it's different. So I think the main thing, one of the things I've done a lot of is I work with people in these countries, like doing training identification courses and workshops to teach people how to identify stuff, how to photograph stuff. And what that information does, when you get a better handle on the species you have, that can go back into government and go to what's called their national plans of action. And it's really that tells you, like, okay, what species do you have in South Africa? And South Africa is pretty good, but a lot of countries, you don't really know what the species are. Until you know what your composition is, it's hard to develop good policy. And I think that's the point, is doing these national plans of action and developing a policy that works for your particular country in the region.
Then a question from Hassan Kasim Ali from Somalia, senior student at Somali National University. They study marine science and fisheries. I myself have been searching this saw shark in fish markets, but the fisherman told me that the shark hasn't been seen since 2000. So what makes them disappear? I think
I kind of answered that one already, but it could be a combination of things. But yeah, the sawfish particularly, that's the one that's just that's one outside Australia and the US. I can see that one completely vanishing from a lot of areas here.
Okay, another anonymous question. In your research and experience, what factors contribute to shark attacks, and are there any particular shark species or regions that pose a higher risk to humans?
That's a really broad question. Again, it's sort of like the other question I just answered. That it's a regional thing in different areas. In some areas you have shark species, like if you're in the more tropical areas, bull sharks, tiger sharks are of a concern. You go up to the KZN coastline, you have all these rivers along there. And for those of you, most of you here probably know that, but bull sharks, like, Zambezi sharks, like to go up rivers. And so you got sharks going up rivers, you have people playing around the beaches. You're going to have interaction with sharks and humans. White sharks, same thing. In California, we have times of the year in Northern California, we have salmon that come up rivers. The seals follow the salmon, like to eat the salmon, and the white sharks like to eat the seals. And of course, if you're a surfer, there's some of the best breaks occur right off river mouths. So it's just, you just get to know the area. It's just, again, it's kind of a broad thing just to talk about. You need to just know the area and what sharks you may or may not be dealing with.
Yeah, sure. And then a question from Mike Bruton. Hi, Dave. Good to hear you again. Congrats on your remarkable career. Are you aware of the Shark Museum in Simonstown established by Dr. Alessandro de Maddalena and his work on shark conservation?
I'm aware of it. I haven't been to it, but I am aware of it, Mike. Hi, Mike.
And another one from Mike. Are you aware that software developed for the Hubble telescope is now used to track whale sharks?
I didn't know that, but I'm not surprised.
He said it's a nice big model species. Yeah. Then a question from Lashatini Legendrum. I'm sorry if I got your name incorrect. Have you personally encountered a Pondicherry shark during your research? And if so, what was your opinion on the IUCN listing it as potentially lost shark nowadays?
That's one of the sort of the iconic species of the lost sharks. And to my knowledge, no one's seen one at least since the 1970s. And it's one that everybody's always kind of looking for. And I can't tell you the number of people send me images of sharks they think might be the Pondicherry shark, and it always turns out to be a different species. And so that's kind of one of those iconic lost shark species.
Where are they normally from?
Normally they're up in the northern Indian Ocean, India, Sri Lanka, that area, and some of that's sort of the approximate. It was described from Pondicherry, India. So, but yeah, that's all we know about them.
And then another anonymous question: are there a specific species of shark that is more of a target to being more lost and how can it be mitigated, or is it all more dependent on location or something else?
It's really depends, that's another broad question. It depends on, again, it's more of a local question to ask, like what species of sharks. It's knowing what the fauna is, and a lot of people don't really know what the fauna is. In South Africa, it's pretty good because they have a long history here, but a lot of countries don't. Because I go there and they don't really have an idea what species occur there, and that's really the foundation of any determining thing is like what species do you have there, and then what species are commonly seen or not seen, and that's just doing a lot of grunt work, going out and looking around to see what they have. It's out there.
And then one from Lisa Swart. I run a tagging program on the South African south coast at De Hoop. We are seeing lesser guitarfish and shy sharks. Is it an MPA? As it is an MPA, there is no active fishing except the tag and release research. Are there other environmental factors that could be responsible for shark declines other than fishing?
Yeah, there's a very good possibility. It could be other things. It could be habitat degradation, which actually does in some areas of the world. Is it like, for example, sawfish, good example. Mangrove areas are really important for their life history, and a lot of areas have been taken out for development, other types of things. So habitat, look at what's going on, coastal stuff or habitat development stuff. If people want to put in cruise ships or hotels, whatever, and that has, we know that's impacted certain areas of the world, like sawfish, for example. So that is something to look at. So I think it's important to look what other oceanographic things, other things just besides fishing, because it could be other things that are occurring. I guess you need to look at the area and know a little bit about the history of that area too.
Because the MPA has been in place for quite a long time.
Yep. Yep.
Wow.
Yeah.
Great.
One quick question, Dave. Taxonomy obviously is one of the, let's call it the fundamental skills of science, right? And then as we progress and technology has improved, now there's all sorts of things that people are getting into, drone surveys and all that kind of stuff. But there seems to be a movement, not like a conscious movement, but a movement away from taxonomy towards the cooler, more technological things like browse and DNA and whatever. But there's still a fundamental need for taxonomy, but it seems there's not a massive cohort of young people coming into taxonomy. So just to sort of put it out there, what are the opportunities for people to get into taxonomy? It obviously it interests some people. There needs to be like a little bit more of a draw. What are the opportunities?
It's a hard field to do taxonomy because there's not a lot of jobs there, and a lot of people, like a lot of my students that I train in that, they end up somewhere else in the fishery stuff, but because they have that training, having come through my lab, they'll ask questions that normally fisheries people won't ask, like in terms of the species and stuff. But it's not it's something you really have. So it's a passion you have to pursue, because there's just not, when it comes to job opportunities, there's not a lot of jobs there. And so a lot of times when you're in grad school, that's your best opportunity to do something, but to use those skills that you can carry them on. I had one of my former students, Vicky Vasquez, she did a Parker master's thesis, was named in this new shark called the Ninja Lantern shark. And we actually named this after Peter Benchley in 2015, because it was the 40th year anniversary when Jaws came out. And what she did, because she has more of a, she's kind of into the, works with kids and younger people and in low income communities, she got a group of 8 to 14-year-olds to actually come up with the name Ninja Lantern shark. And it was totally cool. She actually did a video of the whole thing, but it got all these people. I mean, think about it, if you're, 8 to 14, you get a chance to name a shark. And that's the kind of inspirational stuff that, even though they may not have a job at some point in their life, they might have, you never know where that could go with some young person that get inspired, like to name something. So yeah, and it's just something, it's a good skill to learn, but it's going to be hard to find a job in that field. But you can still use that and apply it to whatever you might pursue.
Seems like children have a better idea of naming things than adults when it came to that research battle of boating that boat face. So
Yeah.
Ninja Lantern shark is better.
Yeah.
Dave, has anybody looked at, we know with some species of fish, as the temperatures change, they move out of warmer water or whatever it is. Have you done anything like that on shark fin?
Yeah, some people do some of that type of stuff with shark stuff, but like with temperature change, you've got to look over the longer term, I think. I mean, I can tell you, like in California, like we know, like the water temperatures were warmer actually back in the mid 1800s than they are now. And then we know that because there are a lot of fish species that records were recorded back in the 1800s. because of water, because of different oceanographic things, and it's cooled down. A lot of the species now you gotta go down to Mexico and find. So the short answer is yes, but I don't think it's an area that people have not really spent much time looking at in the bigger picture, or to look at a global scale when they should really look at a more regional scale, in my opinion.
But there's nothing in the chat. Hold on. Okay.
Okay.
I think we'll probably call it there. Dave, thank you very much.
Welcome.
Well, really another great, interesting talk. And yeah, thanks everyone for attending.